Greetings. My name is Asad Ali Jafri. On behalf of the National Jazz Museum in Harlem, welcome to Jazz and the Creative Influence of Islam, supported by Humanities New York. In this ongoing series of conversations and performance, we will be exploring the contributions of Islam and Muslims to the birth and continued growth of jazz. Today's session is Manifesting the Spirit in the Music. The deep connections between jazz and the creative influence of Islam at their root have a spiritual manifestation that builds on the legacy of Black American music forms. This manifestation of the spirit allows for an exploration that brings together stories, geographies, faiths, and musical forms, responding to real-life conditions of past and present while imagining the future. Today, we have two very special guests from California, Dr. Rasul Miller and Sister Destiny Muhammad. And we're joined by my good friend from New Haven, moderator Abdul-Rehman Malik. And with that, over to you, Abdul-Rehman.
Thank you, Asad, and assalamu alaikum to everyone who's tuning in and watching. I feel really blessed and privileged today to be with Sister Destiny and Dr. Rasul. And at the end of these 75 minutes, I know you will know why and you will feel why, because I have a feeling that this conversation is going to be about the heart and the soul and the spirit. And, you know, we were talking a little bit earlier and reflecting on the jazz tradition and saying to ourselves, this is a tradition in which spirit is everything. Spirit encompasses the wholeness of it. Spirit encompasses the past of it. Spirit inhabits the present of it. And spirit gives us a sense of where it's all going. The two individuals that I'm speaking to today, in some ways, are at the forefront of exploring what that means. The histories of it, the lineages of it, the genealogies of it, and the doing of it and the practice of it in the here and now, in the world that we inhabit and live in. I don't think we can begin this conversation about jazz, spirit, Islam, and the soul without reflecting a little bit on a great passing that I think all of us have experienced in the last few weeks, and that was the passing to the next realm of Pharoah Sanders. And I'm holding Pharoah Sanders's album Thembi because over the last few weeks, I've found myself going back to the morning prayer again and again in remembrance of Brother Pharaoh, in remembrance of his genius, in remembrance of his practice, but in remembrance of what he represented. He was an individual through whom so many spiritual lineages in jazz crossed. John Coltrane, Lonnie Liston Smith, Sun Ra, Majid Shabazz, McCoy Tyner, just to name a few. This is the Pharoah Sanders who was comfortable on the world's greatest stages and comfortable with the Ganawa musicians of Northern Africa and the Maghreb. And this was Pharoah Sanders, who, as one of his students recently told me, was so dedicated to seeking blessing in his life that he would get upset if anyone paid for lunch or dinner when he took them out, because he said, don't deny me the blessings. It was a story that someone told me recently, and it hit me because this was an individual, like so many individuals within this lineage, within this genealogy, within this art form, who not only live the music, but the music lives through them in the way in which they live and conduct their lives. Destiny Muhammad, in some ways, needs no introduction. A remarkable innovator, a remarkable preserver of lineage, a harpist who's performed with some of the most profound and innovative personalities in music today. But the thing that strikes me, Sister Destiny, about your work in a very personal way is there's never a time when I don't listen to your music that I'm not transported. You're not playing those strings as I hear them. You are communicating a language that really transcends body and goes to that oceanic spiritual place that Rumi often reminds us of. So I want to say, first of all, thank you for sharing and for allowing us to share in that magnificent work that you do and that magnificent practice which you share. And perhaps I'd love to start with a remembrance of Brother Pharaoh Sanders. And when we were talking earlier, you referred to the time that you met him.
Well, first of all, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa
And
alaikum
I'm
salam.
so honored and blessed to be in all of you all's presence. Just thank you for this invitation to share, and especially with the doctor, Rasul Miller. Thank you, brother. Many years ago, when I was a shorty in this music, I was in Los Angeles at an herbalist shop off of Crenshaw and Slauson. His name is Russell Harrison. And this herbalist, I don't know how my husband and I met him, but we met him. And as I said, I was really just kind of getting started, if you will, but was feeling the call of the music on me. So we're at this herbalist store. There's a cool little spot in the hood, talking to Russell. And Pharaoh Sanders walks in the door to come and get his herbs. And Russell says, dude, I need to introduce you to Destiny Muhammad. She's a harpist and she's bad. And he goes on with the litany. And I said, I'm a shorty in this. And Pharaoh is kind and generous. He asked me if I knew about Turiya Sangeetananda, who the rest of the world knows as Alice Coltrane, and about Dorothy Ashe. He asked me a few questions and asked me about my harp. At that time, I was playing primarily Celtic. And I was just like, wow, I'm meeting this man who actually walked the planet with the John Coltrane and played with Alice Coltrane on the whole journey into Satchidananda. And so he says, it's such a pleasure to meet you. I pray to meet you again. He gave me the blessings. May Allah continue to shower you with infinite blessings. And he got his herbs from Russell. I did not see Pharaoh again. So we flash forward, maybe about 10 years later. I'm invited by I want to say that he had played with Pharaoh, and he did. His name was right there, Azar Lawrence. Fierce jazz saxophonist who was with Pharaoh as well as McCoy Tyner. And Azar calls me. I don't know how this man got my phone. He calls me, he says, I'm coming to Oakland. Would you come and play with me at Yoshi's, which is a cool jazz club here in Oakland? I was so enamored, yes. He sends me over the music that I need to learn. I'm learning it at light speed as I can because he's literally coming like about 2-3 days later. So here I am getting ready to step on stage with Azar Lawrence. And I mean, like 3 minutes before we step on stage. And Benito, who's the pianist, he says, you know how you got this hit, right? And I said, no, I don't know. He says, Pharaoh Sanders recommended you.
Wow.
To this day, I'm still speechless. I never played with my, but he spoke my name with the grace and says, this is who you want when you go to the Bay.
Wow. Destiny, it is a story which is so moving because it feels like spirit met spirit that day.
Yes.
For just a moment in that little shop with that beautiful little encounter, and the hearts knew each other, and he knew you, and he knew what you could bring. That is, there's a generosity, isn't it? And
Yes.
that grace and a kindness in that. And to me, it seems that grace and generosity and kindness sometimes aren't words that we associate with the music and the tradition. We speak about the ferocity of the playing, or the way it which sort of engages us. It's an assault on the heart, the senses, the soul. But this story reveals that other side to what you and the incredible musical community that you work with do. There's a kindness and a generosity and a compassion and a love that imbues it. How important has that love, Sister Destiny, been for you as you've grown as a harpist, as a musician, as a composer, as a band leader?
It has been everything. It has been everything. I have been mentored either in person or just spiritually by wonderful jazz musicians who, to me, in their own way, haven't even gotten their credit, and they are fierce in their craft. And I remember for years I played at farmers markets, and folks would see me playing at the farmers markets among the fruits and the flowers and literally playing for tips, and see me and say, I know what you're trying to do. I can hear what you're trying to say. One man who joined the Ancestors 10 years ago, Khalil Shahid. Khalil Shahid was the founder of the Oaktown Jazz Workshop, which is still functioning and producing wonderful musicians, to include an Ambrose Akamusiri, Blue Note jazz artist Ambrose Akamusiri. And Khalil saw me playing at a farmer's market, and he asked my name. I said, Desi Muhammad. He said, Salam alaikum, baby. Look, I mean, because he's a straight black jazz head, and invited me to come to a jam session because he said, I can hear what you're trying to say. And the jam session went kind of funny. I'll go into that maybe later on if we have time. But he said, I've started a jazz workshop for kids. You should come and study with me. And I didn't have the nerve then, but the last 4 years of his life, I asked if I could come, and I think he thought I was only going to come once. That workshop went every Wednesday, and I went every Wednesday until he stepped into the ancestor realm. And here I am studying with kids that are old enough to be my children, probably even my grandchildren at this point now. And they didn't treat me any different, and he didn't treat me any different from these youngsters. I can hear what you're trying to say. Get them chord progressions right. Quit playing. I can hear you. There's been this level of tough love generosity that I have been exposed to. And I will share this. I recognize now as a band leader that some of my female contemporaries in this music may have had a different route. I've spoken with women who have had some other things that have not been appropriate or even gentle and nice. My experience, I've had a couple of times of that, but I also was a barber and I come from the hood. And so, you know, I would share with folks, don't let the smooth heart fool you.
Dr. Rasul, you're listening to Sister Destiny, and we're talking about the this kind of generous meeting of hearts was that wonderful moment with Pharaoh, but also this tradition, that at the heart of this tradition is a love and a kindness, and as you just said, Destiny, a beautifully kind of encapsulated tough love generosity. That in this love and this generosity there is rigor, right? Where there's rigor, we're gonna shape the soul and the heart and expand it even further. And that process of expanding it isn't easy. It takes all of us, our abilities, our sensibilities, our lived experience, because if the heart's gonna open, there's a lot of work that has to be done. And Rasul, I know you recognize that as someone who himself comes from spiritual lineage, and someone who has been a cultural producer, and now is a historian, and you in some ways, Rasul, live between the past and the present and the future constantly, because that's your work. That's what you're communicating to your students. That's what you're doing in your academic endeavors. First of all, reflection on Brother Pharaoh Sanders.
Wow. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد الفاتح لما أغلق والخاتم لما سبق ناصر الحق بالحق والهادي إلى صراطك المستقيم وعلى آله حق قدره ومقداره بسم الله. First of all, thank you all so much, and thank you so much, Sister Destiny, for sharing those stories. I'm yeah, man, that Pharaoh Sanders story is like subhanallah. So the reflection I will give on Pharaoh, I mean, I have two things to say. One is Farrell helped me get through my PhD program. When it was time for me to sit down and write this dissertation, I remember talking to a friend of mine, a brother you know as well, Abdul-Rehman, a brother by the name of Bilal Ware, who wrote a book called The Walking Quran by the Islam of West Africa. And, he's another PhD, a few years ahead of me, came through the same institution in Penn. And we talked to him saying, man, like sometimes writing, this thing is heavy, trying to just block out the noise and focus. And, we had a conversation about like maybe the spiritual elements of that. And he suggested I listen to, some different praise poetry and whatnot. So I listened to a little bit of that. But at some point, it occurred to me, since, my dissertation is about Black Muslims in New York City, a lot of folks in the jazz scene. I don't know, something just said, man, put on some Pharaoh. And I had like a moment where it was just Pharaoh on loop, just to kind of help me tap into whatever I needed to tap into to write, so that's my intimate kind of journey with Pharaoh. But the second thing I'll say is, and may Allah reward him for that, that I was able to benefit from. But the second thing I'll say is, I think Pharaoh really encapsulates sort of how intimate the relationship between Islam and jazz is, and how obvious that is for those of us who are ingrained in the culture, who are part of the culture, and how strangely illegible that can be to people who are not. I, remember reading, different sort of academic, or maybe not even necessarily academic, but different written pieces about Pharaoh. And one of the things that I would keep seeing is there would be this refrain of, oh, he was one of those artists who was very much, interested or influenced or just kind of adjacent to Islam. And I'm like, my man named the album Sumum Book, like this obscure phrase from Surah Al-Baqarah, but in some ways, I mean, that's kind of what's beautiful about the relationship, it's not about sort of outside observation, it's an organic, lived relationship. It's the same thing that makes, the deep engagement of Black folk, African American folk with Islam in this part of the world, what makes it surprising to some people, and it's almost like, if you don't live this, if you're not in community with the people, then you won't understand, how organic that connection is. And I'll leave it at that.
So let's take it a step forward, because I think that for all of us here, we can't even conceive of something called jazz without it.
Right.
Because it is so woven. I wouldn't even say baked. It's woven. The threads of it, the threads of lineages spanning continents, spanning oceans, spanning millennia, link everything about this discipline, this ecosystem, this universe that we have names for, and we'll use jazz as our shorthand today. That this ecosystem is so deeply woven with the things that appear to us as coming from Islam, and that are deeply ingrained by those whose lives and hearts and practice, and whose minds and lives were motivated by a relationship with it. And in a way, that discussion around, and I'd love to hear how you feel about this, Sister Destiny, is that in some ways, reading those obituaries of Pharaoh Sanders, it was like those words can never be complete,
right?
Because you just have to listen to the music, you have to open up the albums, you have to see the liner notes, you have to see the visual as much as the oral language that Pharaoh and others are using, indicating, guiding us back to places and spaces and traditions and soul culture that means something that we can kind of experience and encode and see, at least through a certain lens, as Islamic and Muslim. I think there is no jazz without an acknowledgement of this, Sister Destiny.
The fact that you would use the term acknowledgement as it reflects back to the John Coltrane. And that love supreme, the sweet, but the first piece, acknowledgement, where he has the litany that is coming from every portion of himself, and he's really speaking the complete submission. I will do all that I can. And you move forward, and here's Pharaoh writing, the Creator has a master plan, peace and happiness for every. These words are all about Islam. They're all about the divinity that is always calling the spirit of the individual to seek me with all that you are. We just happen to call it jazz. We just happen to call it that. When we submit to it, we really are submitted to this infinite, everlasting being that we call Allah, that our contemporaries call Jehovah Jireh. You know, when we submit to it, and then as a jazz artist, as my brother Rasul says, we call our instruments the axe. And the axe, a part of my title, Harpers from the Hood, as well as sound sculptress. The sound sculptress is that I remember one of the elder cats when I was coming to it said, we're going to carve away everything that is not jazz. That's what your axe does. And what happens sometimes for many of us is that folks don't understand the complete submission to the music, because when it calls, we chasing it with hot passion and love and the curiosity of children, because we want more of that. Whatever that is, there used to be a song back in the day which said you can call it what you want to, whatever feels right. We're chasing it with hot pursuit because we want more of that. We want more of that communion, more of that union. And so jazz just happens to be the thing that calls us. We call it jazz, but its name continues to transcend. Some of our younger contemporaries have taken on the conversation of a Yusef Lateef, which my brother and sister, brother Lufuki and sister Tazeen, saying that brother Lateef didn't want to call it jazz. They didn't want to call it that, but whatever it was, even to them and us in this moment, it continues to call and express itself so richly that we can't help but submit to it.
Let's go back to some of those moments where these individuals and these lineages were meeting, and Rasul, you know, you and I in the past have spoken a lot about the histories of the emergence and the continued development of this music we call jazz, and where it was taking place, and the kind of conversations that were imagining. As Sister Destiny, you were speaking, I actually it's almost like an experiment in the imagination. What would it have been like to sit in the same room as John Coltrane, Pharoah Sanders, first Naima, and then Alice Coltrane, and McCoy Tyner, and Max Roach, and the magnificent
Abby Lincoln,
and the magnificent Hassan, and to be in those rooms as the music is being played, and I can only imagine what words and what knowledges, what insights, what exegesis was being shared as the music was emerging and being created. Rasul, I know you thought a lot about this. You thought a lot about the places where these conversations have happened. Take us back into some of that milieu. Make it come alive for us, brother.
For sure. I'm as we talk, I'm texting our brother Asad to remind me about a conversation that he was telling me about. Anyway, if he maybe he'll respond, and we'll talk about that in the conversation a bit. But certainly, I mean, so I think a friend of mine shared a quote or an observation that he heard from Questlove from The Roots, and he said that, and I don't, I might be butchering the quote a bit, but to paraphrase, it was something like, the best music is always connected to or produced by some kind of movement, right? And you can't understand this music without understanding the communities that the musicians who make the music are produced by, and stay in community with, right? It's not like they're produced by and they go off somewhere. They stay in community, they stay drawing from that well. My research, my work, in my life has been very much connected to just sort of a snapshot of that in New York City. I grew up primarily in South Carolina, but I would spend my summers in New York, and a couple of my sort of adopted uncles in the Carolinas were musicians who had lived in New York. And from that, and then subsequently from, the research and whatnot, which, I say research, but really the research was just talking to these elders and to the communities that they were a part of and other people who were in those communities. And what I found is that, so in New York City, you had this really beautiful, robust, dynamic community of musicians, many of whom were Muslim. And interestingly enough, many of whom were, I guess what we might say, called Sunni or Orthodox Muslims, right? A lot of times the literature would give you the impression that, Black folks didn't know anything about Orthodox Islam until, I don't know, maybe the 60s or the 70s, right? It's not true, right? You have a number of prominent musicians who were active in New York City. Art Blakey comes to mind, who are members of the Ahmadiyya movement. And people like Yusuf Lateef, Ahmad Jamal, and the Ahmadiyya movement was very prominent, right, at this particular time. But you also had a number of, what we would call Sunni or Orthodox Muslims. So many of these folks were worshiping at the mosque founded by Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal and his wife, Mother Khadija Faisal, on State Street in Brooklyn. Around 1939. So by the 1950s, this was kind of like a hub of both Islamic community life in New York City and the jazz scene in New York City. You had a percussionist by the name of Abdul-Rehman, who was, remarkable, who played with a number of prominent musicians, people like Randy Weston, people like his friend Ahmed Abdul Malik, of course, legendary bassist who played with Coltrane and Monk, right? Bilal Abdul-Rahman was also an educator. And his wife, Mama Rakia, was, is a legend in Brooklyn for her work as a cultural sort of curator and ambassador. And they opened up a restaurant in Brooklyn called the African Quarters. And this was, it's been described by some historians as the first African restaurant in New York City. So you had these kind of venues, these kinds of cultural institutions that were hubs for both its Muslim community life and for the jazz scene. And one of the reasons why, and this isn't, this is just kind of maybe this is something that as a historian, kind of interests me, but one of the things that you find is that at that time, folks who practiced what we would call Sunni Islam and folks who were part of the Ahmadiyya movement, the line between them wasn't so stark, right? It was very porous, which is one of the reasons why historians sometimes presume that anybody who was Muslim, who wasn't a member of the Nation of Islam or the more scientific, must have been Ahmadiyya, because not a lot has been written yet about, these Black African-American Orthodox Sunni Muslims, what have you. But in any case, I say all that to say, what I found was from my own journey as a young man, as a Muslim, I kept meeting these uncles, right, who had been members of Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija's community, right? And they would tell me about this early history of Islam in New York City in the 1950s and just kind of this engagement with Orthodox Islam and the theology and the practice. But they were all also musicians. and I was a musician, right? So it was like this real interesting, like I'm seeing a pattern here, and that kind of became an entry point for me to learn more about this history and learn more about these communities that existed in places like New York and Philadelphia and Newark, New Jersey, where Islam was a part of the scene, right, of the jazz world, of these communities of musicians. And what I found really interesting is that, I mean, I really appreciate how Sister Destiny framed it as, jazz as being this kind of force that you kind of get drawn into, that you kind of are called to submit to. What I found is that the same kind of impulse that fueled the kind of spiritual seeking that marked these folks' lives that I was, sort of learning from and being, kind of in community with as a nephew, right, as an adopted nephew. It was the same, spirit that fueled their search to make music that reflected the profound spiritual nature of reality. That's the best way I could try to put it. The same kinds of conversations. I remember having a conversation with one of my jazz instructors, a brother by the name of Paul Jeffrey, who's now joined the Ancestors, who I benefited from greatly as a student down at Duke University. And he was a brother who played with folks like Dizzy and wrote for a number of amazing jazz. He was on the scene, right? He was with the greats, and he was a great in his own right, particularly as a composer. I remember I asked him one time about Coltrane. I said, I've heard, and he wasn't Muslim, right? And I told him, I've heard people say Coltrane was a Muslim. Did you ever get that sense? And he said, yeah. But he said, just very flatly, he said, yeah. He said, but Coltrane didn't like to talk about that kind of stuff a lot. He didn't like to talk about politics. He felt like whatever message he had to give people, he could give it best through the music, right? And I thought that was a really profound statement. And that statement kind of changed the way I listened to the music and listened for the kind of spiritual and political sensibilities that folks had in the music. I remember having a conversation with my dad. My dad came up in Jersey, spent a lot of time in New York as well. And I remember him telling me about, meeting and having a number of conversations as a young man with Sister Aminata Museka, Abby Lincoln. And, just the way in which spirituality, history, music, all of this stuff was interwoven in an organic way. And then me, myself, as a person who was born in the 80s, and in addition to being a musician, playing the trumpet, I wrote, heavily involved in just the scene as an MC. And the same way in which there was this organic relationship between all those things, I saw it in my own experience, in the hip hop scene. It became very clear to me from a historian's eye that the same kind of processes were happening, right? The same, when I would read historians talk about the emergence of bebop and these communities of young musicians who were simultaneously saying, I'm tired of these people calling me boy, we're gonna start calling each other man, becoming interested in cultivating a kind of virtuosity, right? Going back to what you described, Sister Destiny, as that generous, tough love, right? And at the same time, being interested in Islam, being interested in histories of our people that don't start with enslavement, right? Very organically, this is the same conversations we were having as young men in the 90s, young men and women, that you begin to see come out in the music in really important ways. So that even when you say, Yusuf Lateef didn't want to call it jazz, like this is a cultural force, a sort of cultural reality that I think, continues to be expressed in the music, even if the clarity with which it gets expressed kind of wanes from time to time.
Sister Destiny, I heard you there, and I felt you resonate with what Rasul is saying. How are you processing what he's saying and making sense of it?
Oh, when he used the word cultural virtuosity, and the cultivating virtuosity through the tough love that was coming through the musicians who were playing the music, and then layering that with the conversation in regards to hip hop and rap, that and that, as you shared, even though the truism or the healing aspect, this is Destiny Muhammad speaking, that at one time was there, has been watered down, and becomes something else that's so commercial that it's almost an assault, if you will, on this the human spirit, because there used to be so much truism that was coming forth from hip hop and rap. The conversations, when I even think of a Gil Scott Heron, that were coming through the rap, previously, and even looking at this generation now of young lions and lioness. I love how Robert Glasper, he did a 5-minute segment on YouTube talking about hip hop and rap, being that jazz is the grandparent or the parent of this movement. And so even now when I see that there's like a unification or a generational move to move the conversation of jazz and hip hop back together, where perhaps they had thought, that jazz was too old, if you will. But even both are actually bringing forth the cultivating of the virtuosity by that tough love. That was the thing that I was resonating with. It was something, so much of what you said, and it comes so quickly. But those are the things that I think get lost, and so we don't have generations, especially of Black folks and youth, having the conversations also that are respectful.
Mm.
These are joint genealogies. They're the and like you said, Rasul, and like you're saying, Sister Destiny, that they're coming from rivers that have very, very deep origins. They're coming from deep origins that are deeply encoded in the soul, and those souls are encoded in a very, very deep past. And in a way, I think one of the things that I've come as really just a mere student of this discipline is to understand that what the names that we've mentioned and the musicians that I have with me in front of me right now, is that you're calling forth all of that because what the music is doing is actually and is exegesis. It is profoundly spiritual work. It is spiritual exegesis. It is giving contour and a different kind of language to help us understand the core, higher, profound, foundational truths. And sometimes that music is going to lead us deep into the muck and the difficulty and the pain and the trauma of that human experience. But nevertheless, all of that is for us to explicate our relation, our place in a spiritual world. And I'm thinking about Pharaoh Sanders, Someone Bookman Omiyun, as actually that track itself. I found myself reading it next to the ayahs from the second chapter, the verses from the second chapter of the Quran that inspired that piece of music, and finding myself discovering in my own experience of my own sacred text new feelings, and I said more than feelings, new realities that I couldn't give words to, but Pharaoh was giving words to. And I think about the ways, for example, like Doug Karn in his recitation of Ar-Rahman or Al-Ikhlas. What is he doing by reciting the Quran in that way, through that music, if not the deepest exegesis, the deepest exploration of spiritual truths, and in more maybe accessible, certainly not prosaic, because no one can call Kool and the Gang prosaic. But when we're told by scholars like Hisham Aidi that a song like Celebration was written after being inspired by reading the Quran at sunrise, and that this song would just become one of the iconic sort of musical selections of contemporary of this place that we call contemporary America, and yet its origins is a meditation on the verses of the Quran which speak about creation, praising the Creator at dawn. Everything the both of you are saying starts to feel a lot more alive and living. We're hearing it through the music. Sister Destiny, Rasul talked about community. And in a way, as he was speaking, I was thinking that these are communities of conversation, they're communication, they're communities, of spirit and soul, but they're also communities of practice. I would love for you to take us back maybe into a little bit of your origin story, where this relationship and where this nexus, and I'm certain it was always there, but where it kind of appears for you, your music, your practice as a musician, and the way in which you approach that music.
I love that question. When you ask me about my origins, I am a squid kid, as we would call in my community, or Navy brat. And I literally, I could sing almost coming out of the womb, but I couldn't play an instrument. And my mother, who really loved music, would make sure that we heard a variety of music on the radio. And we had lived overseas. I had lived on the island of Okinawa, which is adjacent to Japan. And then we came back to the United States in 1970 and moved to Compton. So I have this whole experience living in Okinawa, and this is before Okinawa became this Hawaii or this resort of Japan. It was rural and bush and living amongst the indigenous people, the Ryukin people. And as I shared, my father was in the Navy, but we didn't live on base, so we actually lived amongst the Ryukin. We come back to the United States, and it's 1970. It's right after the Watts riot. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King have both been assassinated and sent to the ancestor realm. And Black people are Black and mad and joyous and angry and celebrating all of our Blackness. And the radio stations in that area was KJLH. KJLH came a little later, and KGFJ. And they are playing jazz and R&B on the same station. There was no separation like we know of now. And one of the first things that I heard, I want to say, was, Cuba Gooding's daddy was a part of a group called The Main Ingredient. So I'm hearing Cuba Gooding's dad singing, God is on our side. We're not alone, 'cause we're just stones rolling down the mountainside. We all count. And then I'm hearing Quincy Jones coming through with the whole Bodied Heat album, and there's Buffalo Soldier on there, and I Am Just a Man, and the litany of that. This is my exposure. I am hit as a 9-year-old with that music. And then I see Harpo Marx on I Love Lucy playing the harp, which was my idea. That's what I'm doing when I grow up. And when I told my mother, she said, shut up. I'm trying to figure out how to put food on the table, because by this time my mother's become a single mother with 3 children. And so I didn't get the harp until years later. What I can say about God Allah is that the long way around for Allah is the shortest way home. My mama used to say that. And so I didn't get it at 9. We went through a whole series of very humbling experience coming from the island of Okinawa with a dad who's a chief petty officer and popping his collar, to coming back to Compton, California, and have to go through the welfare system and living in the projects in the hood. It was like taking us all the way down. I became a barber so that I could actually, shortening the story, I became a barber as opposed to going ahead out of high school and figuring out how to get into college to study music, because we were living in the projects. And as a firstborn, if any of you are firstborn, you know that you're trying to figure out how your family is going to make it if you are not there. I got my barber's license and was cutting hair at the height of the crack pandemic in Southern California. and was doing well financially, even living in the projects, but knowing that there was another calling on my life and I couldn't remember what it was. But Allah is generous. Allah is generous. All the times when I could have been snatched off the planet, he said, no, I still got stuff for you to do. I started dating a man when I was 30 years old, whose best friend was a harp builder in the little town called San Juan Batista, about 1.5 hours from here. I got my first harp at the age of 30 in 1992, May of 1992. You can't tell me that God isn't generous. I'm going to give it to you, but I need for you to do this. I need for you to have this, because when you get it, I have something else for you to do. And then all of that music started to come back. I started to hear the tones of Chaka Khan when she was Chaka Khan and Rufus. I started to hear that Quincy Jones. I started to hear that music coming back and wondering if I'm ever going to be able to play that on harp. Then I hear Alice Coltrane doing Blue Nile and wondering, am I ever going to be able to play that? And in the jazz world, as my brother, Dr. Rasul, may know, you have folks who are experts in this music. They can't play nothing but the radio. And this man, my boyfriend at the time said, my girlfriend played harp. And this man who's a jazz aficionado looks down at me and he said, if you can't play like that, as Turi is just blazing on Blue Nile, he said, you can't play. And I was like, well, damn, I can't play. I don't even, I can't. At that time, I was like 3 years into it. But that Blue Nile kept coming to me. And I will share with you, because I can talk a while, but I'm doing my best not to. So I'm 9 years old. We moved back to Compton. My mother's trying to figure it out. And there was a bookstore that my mother would take us to on Melrose Avenue in Los Angeles. And it was called the Bodhi Tree Book Store. I think they only have a online presence now. And it was a metaphysical bookstore. So this is, my mother would do this. Sometimes she would take us to the Church of God in Christ, but my mother was already exploring metaphysics. So we would go, had the Holy Ghost moment, and then we would go to this metaphysical bookstore. And as I was 9 years old, I would make my way over to Eastern philosophies. And here's a picture of Alice Coltrane that would lead in. Oh, I was, right? I'm already getting the signs, but it's like, not yet. There's more. And so I'm getting the signs, but they're in these increments that only I can digest. And it's like she's looking at me. I can feel her presence looking at me. And I'm like, Alice Coltrane, why do I know that name? Why do I know that name? We fast forward years later, and I'm finally playing the harp, and I get invited to go to the ashram that she had in Southern California. As my husband and I are driving on the ashram, Turiya Sangita Naimada is driving off because she's been called to India. I miss her in the body. But the spirit of Turiya, I got invited by SF Jazz, our jazz at Lincoln Center here. I get an email that says, would you be willing to come and do a tribute to Alice Coltrane in 2017? They send it to me in 2016, and we want you specifically to focus in on the Journey into Satchidananda album. You could have pushed me over with a potato chip. I was, right? And so that's why I share is that Allah is generous, but what I have known in my almost 60 years on the planet is that Allah wants you to grow up. To grow up so that you can handle all of these blessings, so that your mind don't get blown. You don't start, as grandmothers would say, smelling yourself, misbehaving with the gift. As I step into the big six, I am more humbled by it now than I was when I first got it 30 years ago. even this moment here, to be invited to speak with you illustrious ones, I am humbled by this. And the journey is not over, it's just getting started.
Allahu Akbar. Sister Destiny, when you performed at that 2017 tribute to Alice Coltrane, what was that like? I mean, like you just described something. I mean, I'm the hairs on my arms are standing on end as I'm listening to you, and how the spirit and how the creator has the master plan and is releasing it and guiding. And now you're at this moment where you're asked to not only commemorate but celebrate in almost the highest way a musician can be asked to, is to reinterpret, to deliver again, to bring again the music that for you changed you. And now you engage that music again as someone who's offering it to others. What a remarkable link in that chain, isn't it, Dr. Rasul? You know, we talk about the isnad, we talk about the golden chain which connects us to the generations before, and this is the chain. You're demonstrating the chain right in front of hundreds, maybe thousands of people. What was that experience like, Sister Destiny?
For 6 months, I am listening repetitively to that album. I'm listening because it was going to be 2017 became the 10th year anniversary of her ascension. So I'm listening repetitively to the music. I'm listening and I'm asking her in the spirit, what do you want to hear me share about this album? Because I'm asked to specifically curate it. And so I'm sitting with the music, and for me, none of her music was charted out. So I literally have to go through the oral tradition of listening and looking for who are going to be the best musicians whose spirits are going to be, because it's all about that. We can get folks who can read well and they can play it note for note, but whose spirit is going to be the embodiment of the tonalities that are going to continue to transform the folks who have come to have this experience. It was electric. At SF Jazz, they have their main hall, and then they have the smaller room that's called the Joe Henderson Lab, which actually is really my favorite. And it sits on the corner, and it's like a little glass house. It sold out so quick, people were mad. And folks are standing at the glass looking at us like, let us in. And it was so rich. It was the experience was so rich because each musician brought such a rich spirit. I was so proud of them. The audience was weeping. There was one couple that had bought tickets for both shows because I had to do 2 1 hour. They both ticket and they were sitting in the same spot. I said, y'all agreed, and they were like, it was so beautiful. Folks didn't want to leave. Inside, as I shared, there's the big office, the big room, the minor room, and Joe Henderson. There were folks who had bought tickets to see that 1.5 hour show, bought tickets to see my show, and came over the line going outside to hear it. When we finished, if I could call it finishing, we stepped outside. Folks did not want to leave. Are you going to do it again? My husband and I literally said, we'll produce the show ourselves at another location. And we did. And folks bought tickets to the excellent. Folks wanted to hear that tonality. They wanted to be in the experience that was going to open up their hearts and spirits. This is what we do.
Dr. Rasul, I know you're nodding. You're nodding, and I can see your body's moving to.
Come on, brother.
To Destiny's words. When you began in between the Carolinas and New York City, exploring your creativity and your calling. Did you also find community? Did it emerge out of community? Because you were playing the trumpet, but folks like us at Jaffrey and others remember you as MC Soul Millie. They remember your words and you being in community in Harlem and in Brooklyn on stages with people speaking the truths that you were experiencing alongside them.
For
Where
sure.
does your art, where does your cultural production emerge from?
Well, I'll take a step back. Let me say this. I played the trumpet. I was pretty good at it, but I also know enough that, like, I would not say that I was I couldn't play no trumpet when it really came down to being around people who really knew what they was doing. And for me, it was kind of like a fork in the road at one point. Like, you gonna get serious about this, or you gonna do something else? You know what I mean? And I found my voice in some other things, but the gift of playing the trumpet definitely. I mean, it might have saved my life. I mean, it was the thing that kept me focused and out of trouble and in a good space as a young man. But I ain't trying to be out here fronting like, yeah, I played the trumpet, I'm on screen with, Sister Destiny Muhammad, a real one. You know what I'm saying? So, but
Stop it.
but so for me, like the community piece, it really does go back to being a community with some of the elders. Even this scarf that I'm wearing was something that was given to me, that belonged to a dear friend, uncle, mentor, teacher by the name of Haj Dawood Haroun, who folks may also know as John Mansable Lewis, who who played the trombone and was a phenomenal trombonist, who played with the likes of people like Ken McIntyre and people like Jackie Bird, and he was a member of the Duke Ellington band and the Dizzy Gillespie band at one time. Just a phenomenal artist and also educator and historian in his own right. And he also had been the personal secretary for Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal, and that tough love. I mean, he was one of the folks that I was around that made me really, have to look myself in the mirror and, am I gonna get serious about this trumpet, or am I gonna get serious about something else? And when I began, years later, to go into this direction of history, he was somebody who, again, that generous tough love. He shared so much with me, so much history. He was a man who had experienced life as a young man in Boston in the 1940s and 50s, and New York in the 1960s, and had been to Iran and been to West Africa, and had been very much in community with people of the West African Sufi tradition, with people of the Shia tradition in Iran, and all of that, right? And shared all that with me, but also would keep me honest, because if he had seen so many folks in the realm of academia who didn't keep it real and operate with the kind of level of integrity and work ethic that he certainly embodied in his work, both as a historian and as a musician. So that was the kind of influence that I had. Another brother by the name of Brother Ayub Jones, percussionist, also from that New York City Sheikh Dawood community jazz scene, was on me. Like, if you're gonna do this, you got to do it right, So when it came time for me to try to do this work, I really sought out elders who had lived it, and what I learned from them was, I guess, to try to answer your question more directly, this kind of community experience, I mean, it's a living tradition. Like you talked about that golden chain, the way we learn, whether we're talking about Islam, whether we're talking about Islamic spirituality, whether we're talking about music, it's you learn, just the Jay Electronica line from the last album. If you want to be a master in life, you must submit to a master. You know, whatever it is that you're trying to gain some mastery over, you have to, you know, sit and spend time with, you know, whether it's in the flesh or whether it's through what they've produced, with those who've come before you. You know, so for me, I mean, I was somebody who grew up Muslim, you know, but when I began to connect to the music, to hip hop music, and the kind of expansive tradition of hip hop music, you know, I remember the first time I heard Nas say Nas is like the Afrocentric Asian, half man, half amazing. I got chills. Like, wait a minute, this is somebody giving voice to this reality that I know, that I hear from my dad, that I hear from these elders, you know, in a way that resonates with me. So, you know, yeah, for me, like the hip hop part of it was just organic, and I was good at it. You know, I remember thinking to myself in high school, like, this is the only thing I could ever be great at, because I can be great at this. You know, and for those artists who embodied a kind of virtuosity with the craft of emceeing, you know, they reference, I mean, you know, my favorite MC coming up was Andre 3000, you know, who was, you know, talking about McCoy Tyner and John Coltrane in the music, you know what I mean? Bob James, you know. And then even in terms of like the way in which producers of the art are hearkening back to the generation before them in terms of what they're sampling. I was always somebody who had an ear for samples. And what I loved was when you see a kind of synergy between, you know, the music that is being created and the music that's being sampled, you know. So all of that was just kind of organically a part of, I think, what drew me to wanting to historicize this cultural movement that I myself was, you know, caught up in. You know, I caught the wave, you know. If that makes any kind of sense.
It totally makes sense.
Yeah, and you start to see parallels. You know, you start to see parallels. I mean, I think one of the things that, you know, I mentioned that I saw Sister Destiny, you know, audibly responded to, even if we didn't hear the audio, was this notion that, you know, our people's history didn't start with enslavement, right? And, you know, I mean, I recently was writing a piece, and I was reflecting on Malcolm in the first version of his speech. I believe it was the Ballad of the Bullet, but the first version. There's another version that is, you know, kind of, there's a recording of it that circulates widely that more people are probably familiar with. But one of the original version, he talks about, he says, if you don't want to be treated like a Negro, then associate yourself with Africa, right? Be African. He said, change your name to anything. Change your name to Ooga Booga Mooga. And you'll see how these people treat you differently, because you'll see how silly this man is. And he references a story of a friend of his. He says, I have a friend who's very dark skinned and he wears a turban. And when he goes into the segregated lunch counter, you know, they say, we don't serve no niggers around here, right? And he says, well, I'm not a nigger, you know, and he eats at the lunch counter, you know. And when I heard it, my ears perked up hearing it again as an adult, having done, you know, gone through this journey of trying to become a historian, because I now know who was doing that, right? These were the communities of Muslim artists, jazz musicians, who had a substantive engagement through religion, through culture, through music, through history, with other communities of Muslim people of African descent throughout the world, right? So I mentioned Bilal Abdul-Rehman. I also mentioned Abdul Malik, right? Ahmed Abdul Malik. Ahmed Abdul Malik became so sort of entrenched in the history and culture of the Muslim world that he began to identify as Sudanese. Now we know Sudan, Balada Sudan, is not just the modern day nation state of Sudan, it's the whole geography of sub-Saharan Africa, right? In Senegal, Gambia, Nigeria, Ghana, they call all that the Western Sudan, right? And what was happening is people on the ground who were learning this history in the 40s and the 50s were realizing, okay, so, you know, one term that we can use to link ourselves to that history is Sudanese, right? And people did that, right? And someone like Ahmed Abdul Malik, who learned Arabic, who understood that history, who attended the State Street Mosque and was in community at, Sheikh Dawood and Mother Khadija's masjid, right? For him to say I'm Sudanese said a lot more than saying I'm Black, saying I'm Negro. It's like, no, I'm hearkening to this. I know who I am enough to know that I'm connected to this history of people of African descent on the continent, sub-Saharan Africa. I'm Muslim, so the sort of Muslim community within that larger community, right? And people who knew him knew what that was about. Now, the sort of uninitiated, we might say, from the outside, just looking and say, "Oh, he's Sudanese. It must mean he's an immigrant," right? And that's how they understood it, And Robin Kelly has an awesome chapter in a book called "Africa Speaks, America Answers," where he talks a little about Ahmed Abdul-Malik's story and whatnot. But these were the communities of folks on the ground. So then you fast forward to the 80s and the 90s when people are rediscovering this same reality and the same history. And Islam is just as much a part of that rediscovery as it was in the 1950s and 60s. It only makes sense that people begin to be drawn, to Islam and this kind of Islamic spirituality. But another point that I want to make briefly is one of the things that I feel like I've noticed in studying this history and talking to elders who lived this history is that one unfortunate shift that I think happened. I was talking to Hajj Dawood Harun, may Allah be pleased with him. And I was talking to him about one of the elders who was, an awesome musician. And let me say this too. Let me make 2 points. First point I want to go back and say is Sister Destiny mentioned something about many of these elders not getting their due, right? Many of these musicians not getting their due. So what I found in doing this research on the history of Black Muslim communities in New York City is I found this community of Muslim jazz musicians living in New York who were accomplished musicians who played with Monk when he would come to New York, who played with Train when he would come to New York, who played with these, with Dizzy, but I didn't know their names. And I was, because I played the trumpet, I was a little bit of a jazz head, you know what I'm saying, in high school. And I knew the big names, like, why have I not heard of these people? And what I found is that a lot of them, their life journey took them in different directions where they couldn't dedicate themselves to being, the acclaimed musician. A lot of them they had families, right? Sometimes, they might have had to work a job, to maintain their family. And so they would, and interestingly enough, several of them, now that I'm thinking about it, end up being educators, right? Teaching music, teaching history. And what I found is that, these were folks who, I guess in some ways you could say didn't get their due, right? Some of them did as they got older, someone like Hajj Dawood Harun, has gotten some recognition for how, how heavy of a contribution he's made, but some of them didn't. And I remember a conversation that we had, Abdul-Rehman, about the amazing Hassan from Philly, right? This piano player who, the greats who passed through Philly all recognized as one of the greats, right? But who, unless you're really entrenched in the music, you probably wouldn't have heard of his name. And that was a sort of aha moment to realize that in these communities, you find people who maybe didn't get the same recognition as some of their peers, but got the recognition of their peers and were these gems who, a part of what they did was they served as those links, right? They served as the folks who mentored and taught other musicians and just other people in the community in various ways, right? So that's one thing I want to say.
Sister Destiny, there's so much to explore here, but I want to add another element in these kind of closing moments that we have together, and that is I think that often in our narrative histories of this music, we'll hear the names of legendary men, and I'm so I'm so gratified, not only to be in conversation with you, Sister Destiny, but to, by extension, then be connected in conversation with that lineage, which leads back to Alice Coltrane. And you mentioned earlier on Dorothy Ashby. And I'm thinking now about Dakota Staton. And I'm thinking now, as we know from Richard Brett Turner's recent book, Soundtrack of a Movement, Etta James. And I'm thinking about these women. And often I think the role of women in the nurturing development of the ecosystem is often forgotten. And if it's not forgotten, it's sort of marginalized. And indeed, as Richard Brett Turner reminds us, when Etta James was a member of the Nation of Islam, her name was James Etta X. And we
Wow.
also know from that research that she was one of the first to give the dawah, the invitation of the Nation of Islam, to a young boxer named Cassius Clay. And so these women are in the milieu. They're present. Naima, Alice, Dorothy, Dakota, Etta. They're all there. And I also wonder some of the other great female personalities of this tradition. We might not have the stories right now, but maybe we haven't asked the questions. What were Billie Holiday and Aretha and others? They're interacting, they're intersecting. I love reading the old jazz biographies, Sister Destiny, and you read in some of them these kind of funny moments where a Dizzy Gillespie will joke how someone like a Dr. Yusuf Abdul Latif would walk into the bar after the show and would order a Coca-Cola, and all the other brothers would laugh and say, there he is, he's a teetotaler, he's high on something else, he's high. And they would all laugh and they'd be there, and I could just imagine what those conversations, and I know women were there as well. And I wonder, Sister Destiny, how you approach that as a woman who's part of this incredible tradition and who's referenced the saintly figure of Alice Coltrane as part of that, as part of that lineage.
Wow. I want to go back before I touch that. Can I talk a little bit about Dorothy Ashby?
Absolutely.
One of the things is that folks aren't aware of really about Dorothy Ashby that I want to share, that I learned. She had already joined the Ancestors by the time I came to the harp, as that Dorothy Ashby with her trio were the opening act. She and Donald Byrd of the Blackbirds were the opening act from Malcolm X at the Ford Auditorium in Detroit. It was the Afro-American, not African, but the Afro-American broadcasters that invited her because Malcolm loved jazz. See, this is something else.
Wow, that's an incredible story, an incredible historical moment.
You have a Black woman who is adamant about the upliftment of Black people, who is in support of Malcolm X and is playing jazz for this brother. This is a story that doesn't get told. And how I found it is that someone had purchased her estate, probably at one of these where folks store things, had purchased that and had all of these things on eBay. And here was this I'm calling it a pamphlet, but a program that had her name in it and a picture of her with her trio. To see that Dorothy was a fierce writer, band leader, and her husband, she and her husband actually wrote plays about the Black experience and how to evolve it. Alice Coltrane, when she came as Alice MacLeod, and before, she had been married to someone else before whose name escapes me at this moment, a jazz artist who was a vocalist. But when she came to John, she was so enamored with his sound, even though she was already fierce. She wanted to support exactly what he was doing. Allah saw differently. Allah saw differently. Yes, you can, and I'm going to bring it home and allow you to take it to the next level. So here she's working as in the Hindu experience, but wanting to unite the sound of Islam, the sound of the bhajans, and the gospel experience that again does not get talked about. And if you ever I had an opportunity to sing bhajans after her ascension at the ashram, and all I heard was the gospel. And so what I see is, and I don't give myself permission to stand on the shoulders of these ancestors. I'm standing on their feet because I need all that protection and juice and blessings from them. I'm not trying to stand on the shoulders just yet. But as I stand on their feet and I feel their presence and them giving these inspirations and ideas and throwbacks from when they were physically here, Allah provides that. So I can get out here and do this work. I know I'm not alone in this. I meet up with other jazz artists, women in this work, and we move through it in the way that we best understand it. For me, this is the way. That's why I share Allah needed for me to grow up. As I went through that barber experience, and I'm working during the crack pandemic, I'm working on dope dealers. I've often called them urban apothecarians, depending on what the circumstance is. But it's something to work with, to work on people. If you've ever laid hands on people, there's an energy on people. I would shower profusely afterwards, after work. We work on people who that is their life, and then they start to share stories of how they came to that. And so as I moved into becoming a musician, there are times I can feel that energy that allows me to have more compassion and empathy, even for the folks that I'm working with and on and the audience that have come through there. I feel like Allah gave me those opportunities so that I could infuse that in my music and infuse it in whatever message along with the music gets to come through. And I don't edit it or deny it, even in this moment.
So I want to jump in.
Go ahead, Rasul.
Possible. So something you said, Sister Destiny, really resonated with me when you talked about, and this is kind of going back to the point I wanted to make before, when you mentioned Malcolm loving jazz, right? And Sister Jamesetta X, having a hand in introducing Brother Muhammad Ali, to the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And even going back to talking about Sister Aminata Museka, Abby Lincoln, and her husband Max Roach, also Muslims. There's an important appreciation of culture that we see people like Malcolm, people like Sheikh Dawood before him had. And I think that, I won't say it's been lost, but sometimes people forget it in terms of our religious leadership as Muslims in this part of the world. I remember talking to Hajj Harun, and I asked him, or rather we were talking about a Muslim, another Muslim from the jazz scene, whose name I won't mention now, but he said they had a conversation, and Hajj Harun was an amazing musician, and also was a student of theology, right? It's part of why he was interested in tasawwuf and Shiism, and he actually shared with me that coming up in Boston at the time, I guess this would have been in the 1950s, as a young man who was Muslim, who got introduced to Islam through a Somali family friend as a very young man, as a kid, because Black urban spaces were these kind of international global spaces, right? And but in Boston, he said when we wanted to learn Arabic, we went to the Ahmadiyya Mosque because there was an African American Arabic scholar. I believe his name was Khalil Mahmoud, if I hope I'm getting that right, Khalil Mahmoud, who went on to teach Arabic in other countries and whatnot. Brilliant Arabic scholar, African American. When they wanted to talk about politics and learn about the history of the Black man, they went to the Nation, right? Because the Nation was active in Boston by this point in the 1950s. When they wanted to engage in certain kinds of spiritual practice and dhikr and whatnot, there was, and I don't know anything about this community. If anybody hears this and knows about this community, I would love to, to learn more. But there was a community connected to the Moorish Science Temple in Boston in the 50s where they were making a Sufi Hadra, right? And this is a Sunni Muslim who's traveling around, right? So that's another, kind of the ecumenical piece is I think interesting and important. But he shared with me that he had a conversation with a friend of his who was another accomplished musician, and he was talking about theology, right? And finally, the brother, maybe he got tired of hearing it, and he just kind of politely said, brother, that's your thing, and that's great, and you should keep studying it. You should go further than that. That's not my thing. I'm a cultural Muslim, right? I'm interested in culture and music. And this was a person who I know to have been a very active member of the Brooklyn State Street Mosque Sunni Muslim community. But he made this statement. And what I've reflected on a lot since then is that our communities need to be robust enough to have space for those kind of folks, right? Because those often are the people who, they bring their insight, they bring their wisdom, they bring their gifts. Those are the people often who do work that causes the community to grow and flourish. And when we emphasize just, rhetoric and polemics and even theology, and I think that stuff is very important. I'm really interested in theology and spirituality and all that. But and spirituality is perhaps broader than all of this, right? As we've been talking about. But when we emphasize a certain kind of clerical education and whatnot, we lose people. And I think that's part of why this kind of robust, wholesome healing tradition has waned at different times. Another elder who I interviewed, who was a member of the Daughter of Islam movement, he reflected on me how an imam who did an awesome work. And the Daughter of Islam movement is, for people who don't know, at one time was the largest network of African-American Sunni mosque in the country, did amazing work healing and transforming and protecting communities and spreading Islam. But the folks who led the community were young, these people in their 20s and 30s, right, who had a certain kind of zeal. And this one elder imam reflected to me, as I'm interviewing him, he said, one thing, we were maybe a little bit too harsh in some ways in the early days, because there was a moment when all these folks from the Black Power movement, folks who had been in the Panther Party and whatnot, began to embrace Islam. And if they weren't ready to, make this 180 and devote themselves to a stringent level of practice from day one, we were like, oh, these jokers ain't serious, right? And that pushed a lot of people away, I mean, I'm not taking anything away from him or this movement. This is him reflecting on, as elders tend to do, like, okay, this is how we could have done it even better, right? And sharing that with me, as a younger person. Sheikh Dawood Ahmed Faisal used to write plays. He wrote a play about Samori Toure, and was a musician, was a vocalist, or rather a pianist and a violinist. His wife, Mother Khadija, was a vocalist, right? So they were artists before they embarked on this journey of building what was at the time perhaps the most visible, most important, Sunni or Orthodox Muslim community in New York City, right? And Dakota Staten, and Talib Dawood, members of the Ahmadiyya movement, but they would go to that mosque and worship, from time to time as well, right? And so the community they built was informed by that kind of awareness and consciousness of the importance of culture, as a vehicle to teach, as a vehicle to transform. And so they built a community that attracted all these jazz musicians, right? We fast forward to when I came up in the 90s, I think a lot of our, prominent Sunni Muslim communities had kind of lost that, right? And so you begin to see that energy percolates, in other spaces. In the Nation of Islam, there's an understanding that up until this day, who did I see Minister Farrakhan? I saw a picture of Minister Farrakhan with like Young Thug, right? Young Jeezy saying how, I was starting to have some success and people was coming at me and I was having legal trouble. And just before that happened, the minister called me and said, brother, the enemy is about to, come at you because of your status. I'm paraphrasing, but the 5% Nation, many of the artists I used to listen to, Wu-Tang Clan, me and Asad Always Bond, talking about, Capone and Noriega back in the day. These were folks that had connections with the 5% Nation, the Ansar Allah community, even though many of its members, I think developed a pretty mature and robust and educated, nuanced, sort of sophisticated understanding of the religion, right? But that's their roots and their origin. And I think part of that is because in those spaces, there was a a continued understanding of the importance of culture, the importance of art, and how that's interwoven with our spirituality and our tradition, our history as Muslims in this part of the world. One last point I'll make to just take it back. Even if we look at the origins of jazz, right? The origins of blues, right? This all comes from gospel, right? This all comes from the music that enslaved African people were making, right? And if we trace that back, one of the reasons why the guitar, and stringed instruments, right? And I'd be interested to hear Sister Destiny ruminate on this as a harpist, right? But one of the reasons why the string instrument gained a foothold, and you see the emergence of blues and these musical forms, is because the slave master was scared of the drum. But folks from Muslim societies in West Africa had experience with the string instrument
already. It was already part of the cultural language that they were speaking.
Absolutely.
And playing and experiencing.
Absolutely. Sister Sylviane Diouf, talks about the scholar, the historian. She talks about, she has a presentation where she would play the call to prayer, the adhan from a West African Muslim, and then play like a recording of a field holla, like a field work song, right? And you could hear the parallels between them, right? They say the blue note, even this concept of a blue note, right, actually comes from the musical form of musical forms in the Muslim world going further east that are preserved in Muslim West Africa, where you have a different kind of approach to chords and intonation and minor chords, and huzn, right? This kind of like sadness in the music, this kind of bluesy sound, right? Islam, like you said, is woven from the foundation. So if you know that history, and you know the history of the role of jazz and sort of expanding the appeal of Islam in this part of the world, and you fast forward to the hip hop sort of chapter in that story, if you know all that, then it would be foolish and really at odds with sort of the sunnah of Allah to set up Islam and religiosity as being somehow at odds with these forms of musical and cultural expression.
I think what emerges from what both you and Destiny have been talking about and teaching over the last sort of 80 minutes, 90 minutes, is that both of you belong to, study, explicate the lineages, experience the music of an ecosystem that is so rich, and where things that are seemingly contradictory to some exist side by side in creative concert and creative tension. And out of that, the discipline of the ecosystem continues to expand, emerge. And we have these histories that help us understand that. And in fact, I think the histories of jazz and Islam's deep wovenness into it, and people who called themselves, self-identified themselves as Muslim, their effort, the blood, the sweat, the tears, the tough love, generosity, the commitment, the sacrifice to explicating the world, to doing the exegesis of God's creation, of understanding both the ugliness and the beauty of what it means to be human. All of this to us is a poignant example and legacy. It's not in the past, it's right now. And Sister Destiny, in so many ways, you and people like Ulufuki, Tazeen, so many others are really the heirs, as you said, standing on the feet of this genealogy. And as we conclude, we're gonna send ourselves out with a piece of music that you've selected for us. I know you've given us a few. I'm going to ask you to choose one, and I would be honored if as we kind of leave this conversation, and I want to celebrate this conversation, I want to celebrate what we're doing here at the National Jazz Museum. I think it's high time that institutions like the National Jazz Museum are focusing on giving voice to, creating space for the exploration of all the things which both of you have been speaking about. And long may it continue. May these initial conversations just be openings. Because Rasul, you and I share certain obsessive personalities, coffee and jazz vinyls. We've spent the last 20 years recording in notebooks the names that we find, the little stories that we find, and we're trying to make sense of them. And then we meet someone like Sister Destiny Muhammad, who starts to make the connections, and your mind suddenly goes, oh, that's how it all fits together. Or Rasul discovers that set of interviews or meets those right people, like, oh, we weren't crazy. It all made sense. It was real. This is what was really happening. So I before I ask you to conclude, Sister Destiny, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to you, Dr. Rasul Miller, for the work that you do, for the compassion and generosity you bring to that work, to dedicating yourself to these histories, and constantly being someone who's making that history come alive now. It's not a totem for you. It doesn't exist in the past for you. These are living, breathing stories that I know we have been nurtured by. And Sister Destiny Muhammad, what can I say other than I feel, and I am in the presence of an elder, and you are our elder. And you have carried into this conversation, and those of us who've listened today are just catching reflections of, I know, the multitudes that your work, your collaborations, and your creativity contain. And I want to thank you for sharing that heart with us, that experience with us, aspects of your story with us. Not only is it humbling, but it honors us. I feel honored to be in community with you, and to be even adjacent to these stories, because in our own way, each of these things nurture us in our own way, and I know how much they nurture me. So I want to say Jazakallahu khairan. May the Creator continue to bless you and unfold the master plan for both of you, and in all the work that you do. But Sister Destiny, take us home by introducing to us the piece of music that we're going to hear as we wrap up.
I'm going to choose the piece of music by my brother and friend, Blue Note artist Ambrose Akamusiri, Confessions to My Unborn Daughter. This young man, I have had the opportunity to play on stage with him and watch him just turn into this magnificent musician, educator, daddy. And this piece spoke so beautifully to me, because often the Black man is not seen as the father. He's seen as the absent, the producer who bounces. And Ambrose has a beautiful son, but he had written this prior to the birth of the son. And I love this piece so much that I wanted to reimagine it. The San Francisco Symphony invited me to curate 46 minutes worth of music in the way that I wanted. I said, I'm bringing my people with me. So I'm bringing my people. You want Destiny? I'm bringing my people. They said, peace says, bring them. And so this composition is so rich. I think it's off of one of his first albums. It's so rich because to me it is an homage to Black fathers. It's in its richness, and reimagining it, played by the San Francisco Symphony musicians. It's Matt Wong who also did the arrangement, where you've got the conversation between harp and piano. We are literally playing or reimagining Ambrose's solo at the top of this particular composition. And then, and as you can see, it's actually fairly long because it's 3 minutes. And then it goes into the body of the work, which you're only going to get a pistol click of. So I invite you all to go to San Francisco Symphony, go to the SF Symphony Plus, and you'll see Resilience, which is curated by me during the height of the pandemic that hit the entire world. I was blessed to be able to curate that. It's Matt Wong on piano, Destiny Muhammad on harp, Ron Belcher on upright bass, and Leon Joyce Jr. on drums. I apologize to the San Francisco Symphony musicians who participated in this. They are awesome. Y'all know I love you. I'm not forgetting your names on purpose. I am in this state of excitement. But this piece, I invite you to listen to and to go on and again, San Francisco Symphony Plus, look for Destiny Muhammad, and my curation is called Resilience.
It's a testament to your grace and your generosity and your love in choosing this piece of music by someone you love and you connect to. You demonstrate expansiveness to us. May we all be so expansive and continue to make our circles wider and wider. Dr. Rasul Miller, Sister Destiny Muhammad, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you to Asad Ali Jafri, the curator of this series, my dear friend and visionary and the generous heart who brings people together always in love and purpose. And thank you to the National Jazz Museum for hosting this incredible series of conversations, the first of many for many months and years to come. Thank you everyone for listening, and enjoy Confessions to My Unborn Daughter.